A woman who had never played the piano found her index finger instinctively dancing on the keys the moment she saw sheet music. To understand what was happening, we need to go back a few days. After safely returning from outer space, Jo found that the familiar world she knew had become strange. Relatives, colleagues, and even the color of the car at home seemed slightly different from her memory. Her husband and daughter prepared a belated birthday party for Jo, and during a game of questions, Jo said her name in Swedish. The atmosphere suddenly froze because her husband and daughter had never heard it. Yet Jo distinctly remembered mentioning it more than once, and even her daughter could speak a few sentences of Swedish. Her husband, Magnus, was full of doubts and confronted her about why she seemed like a different person after returning from space. Their relationship had been strained, and he had even prepared for a divorce. Jo exclaimed that it was impossible. She had thought of returning to her husband every moment on the space station. However, Magnus was still cold, prompting Jo to start reflecting. Could her memory be disordered? She re-examined every arrangement at home and noticed a piano in the living room that hadn't been there before. And in her memory, no one in the family played the piano. Jo didn't want to avoid the issue and was ready to talk to her husband. But Magnus immediately started complaining. In his view, Jo had long lost affection for their family, even if she hadn't gone to space. He would spend weekends alone with their daughter at a cabin in the woods. Rumors had already spread among friends that Jo had an affair with a colleague. Magnus, feeling resigned, hoped his wife would openly admit it. Jo could hardly believe her ears. She had never flirted with any colleagues and loved only her husband and daughter. But Magnus wouldn't easily believe her and immediately went to find their daughter. Jo realized the severity of the situation and immediately sought a psychologist. The change in her husband and daughter's attitude, along with her own memory discrepancies, greatly troubled her life. The doctor insisted that this was post-traumatic stress disorder from a life-threatening situation on the space station, a condition not uncommon in high-risk professions, including soldiers, which could even lead to mood swings and loss of control. The doctor prescribed her sedatives for depression, claiming they could effectively alleviate stress reactions. Jo reluctantly accepted the medication, but she was highly resistant. Such psychotropic drugs could dull her reactions, potentially ending her career as an astronaut. After leaving the medical office, Jo put on her uniform and returned to the space agency, where all her colleagues welcomed back the brave astronaut. Only the experiment leader, Henry, looked unsettled as he recalled a space fatality from decades ago, seemingly harboring a great secret. At that moment, the National Space Agency brought unfortunate news. Due to lack of progress, they decided to suspend Henry's quantum entanglement experiment, leaving him silently devastated. Soon after, Henry found Jo, claiming a breakthrough was imminent, and invited her to the lab. During the visit, he casually asked if she had encountered anything unusual in space. As Jo pondered, he shared his own eerie experience from years ago when a colleague was nearly lost in a space trial but was saved by the timely warning from a little boy, which the colleague was certain came from his deceased child. Henry had heard many similar stories and urged Jo to recall carefully. At that moment, there seemed to be a fluctuation in the experimental data. Curious, Jo leaned in to check, and her mind flashed back to the space station. After leaving the company, Jo prepared to pick up her daughter from school, where the kindergarten teacher mentioned that Alice was very reclusive, possibly due to the family environment. Jo noticed the teacher and Magnus exchanging glances from time to time and couldn't help but confront her husband on the way home, asking if he had a special relationship with the teacher. Magnus vehemently denied it, thinking his wife was too sensitive. Back home, Jo discovered her daughter was missing and, while searching, found a familiar bracelet on the cabinet door, with Alice hiding inside. After asking, she learned that the girl liked to stay in the closet for no particular reason. Jo was heartbroken yet also surprised. She remembered Alice as being extremely outgoing. When was she so reclusive? After her daughter fell asleep, Jo approached the unfamiliar piano again. When her hands instinctively touched the keys, a crisp melody began to play, and Jo's face showed shock. She had played the entire piece with muscle memory, which was nothing like someone who couldn't play the piano. Jo finally realized she was indeed ill. She decided to follow the doctor's advice and take the sedatives. Yet the pills looked strangely familiar. She had just returned from space and was undergoing rehabilitation at the base, where the nutritionist had repeatedly instructed her to take vitamins. There was still an unfinished bottle at home, and upon comparison, Jo discovered that the vitamins prescribed by the base were identical to the sedatives. She rushed back to the company lab overnight to confirm whether the two were the same. The component identification showed that the so-called vitamins from the base were actually the mind-altering sedatives. Jo was incredulous, unable to understand why the company would do this, so she hurried to the medical office to open the database. The medical records showed that the company had prescribed this drug to several astronauts who, after returning from space, reported seeing things they shouldn't have. At that moment, the room lights came on, and 2 staff members came to deliver goods, seemingly unaware of Joe's presence until she shouted. The room returned to darkness, and the delivery staff disappeared. Joe was panicked and didn't want to stay a moment longer. As she passed the corridor, she found Henry still in his office, talking to another version of himself on the screen, who suddenly turned around and warned Joe, "Curiosity killed the cat." The scene switched, and Joe's colleague walked into the office, feeling that they needed to have a serious discussion. Hadn't they agreed to leave the space agency together so they could be together forever? Joe was stunned, now unsure whether her memories were deceiving her. In the afternoon, Joe was invited to speak at her daughter's school. She saw her husband and the teacher whispering again, and couldn't help but lose her temper, causing the children to laugh uproariously, further undermining Alice's confidence. On the way home, despite her mother's objections, Alice played music on her phone, which seemed to trigger Joe. She saw the space station again and nearly had a car accident. Back home, her colleague unexpectedly arrived, intending to confront Magnus and openly express his desire to run away with Joe. Joe was speechless. She had no recollection of any involvement with her colleague. Magnus felt humiliated and demanded Joe finally admit the truth. The colleague stirred the pot, suggesting Joe might be mentally unstable, and reminded Magnus to call him immediately if she exhibited any extreme behavior. After another blow, Magnus stormed off. Joe felt her life was in shambles and, while venting, noticed a courier package on the table containing 2 boxes of tapes sent by the Space Station Union, one of which was a recording Joe had made in space. Curiously, she played the tapes, first hearing a hoarse male voice, then Joe's normal message. The other recording was from a female astronaut's final message in 1967, also starting with a hoarse male voice. At that moment, Alice was woken by the noise, finding a memorial service for her mother taking place downstairs. Another Alice suddenly turned to look at her, but soon all the scenes disappeared. Seeing her daughter terrified, Magnus put her in the closet, which Joe thought inappropriate, but he felt his wife was overreacting. As this had always been their routine, Magnus believed Joe really needed medication, but Joe suspected a conspiracy to make her take psychiatric drugs to cover up what she had seen in space. Magnus reached for the phone to call her colleague, but Joe, furious, pushed him to the ground. Although he was knocked out, the phone had already connected. Joe hurriedly hung up and dialed the emergency center, explaining the situation and address before hastily packing to leave. She felt the space agency was against her, likely wanting to cover up her sighting of a female corpse in space. Why else would they give her psychiatric drugs? The tapes she had received were even stranger, containing recordings of her communications with the command center, which Joe clearly remembered had been interrupted. To find out the truth, Joe returned to the space base to check the archive for the communication records, but her access was too limited. The only thing she could open was the recording of the quantum entanglement experiment before the collision. On a whim, Joe ran to the lab, took the experimental equipment, and decided to study it thoroughly, regardless of whether it was related to the collision. The most important thing was to flee the city with her daughter. While passing a restaurant, they sat down to eat. Joe was curious why Alice liked to hide in the closet, as she didn't remember her daughter having this habit. Alice's response alarmed Joe. She mentioned a woman who often said strange things, making her scared, so she hid. Joe thought this was Alice's delusion and suggested drawing the woman to confront her fear. Joe then turned to use a public phone to call the person who sent the tapes. She intended to visit, but the other party hung up without hesitation. Curious, Joe looked up the sender's information and found news online that the person had once served time for forging recordings. Joe felt dizzy, certain that the tape's contents were not forged, as she had indeed spoken those words on the space station. After calming herself, Joe prepared to call her husband about his injuries, but Alice showed her the drawing of the hallucination. It was the astronaut's corpse. Joe couldn't believe it. She had never mentioned this to her daughter. With all these unbelievable events, Joe decided to investigate each one. She first visited the home of the tape sender, where a well-dressed elderly lady appeared. The person who had hung up the phone was her brother. They were amateur astronomers who had once captured a space conversation with old monitoring equipment, but officials firmly denied receiving this information. The siblings began recording these ghost calls, and had even been sued by the space agency, resulting in prison time. Recently, hearing that Joe saw an astronaut's corpse in space, which the space agency vehemently denied, reminded them of the ghost calls they received, which although real, were denied by the agency. The brother feared attracting unnecessary trouble, but the elderly lady felt they should help Joe learn the truth. So, she sent Joe 2 boxes of ghost tapes, recordings from the space station that even the space agency's command center hadn't received. But the old lady had recorded with old equipment. On the table, Alice saw a familiar face in a photo. It was a young Henry. It turned out he had also visited before, trying to retrieve recordings from Apollo 18. Joe remembered an accident had occurred during that mission, and Henry was the only survivor. Seemingly changed afterwards. The elderly lady suddenly told her to be quiet. They had been under surveillance by the space agency all along. She told Joe that if she wanted to know the truth, she should join her on a trip to the sea. Mysterious events often occur in the universe. Once, 6 astronauts saw a purple orb in the space station, which even made the newspapers. As the small cargo ship slowly started, the elderly lady said they needed to sail 8 nautical miles forward, a place like the boundary between 2 spaces, where they could capture sounds usually unheard. She then pulled out a tape from 1967, the last communication from a female astronaut before an accident. After some static, a woman's voice emerged. The elderly lady had checked. The only female astronaut who had launched that day was Irina from Russia, but she had safely returned to Earth. So, who was the dead woman? As Joe pondered, the elderly lady inserted another tape, which unexpectedly played the commander's voice. Joe's face changed dramatically, feeling it was fabricated. As she had seen him die in the space station, the elderly lady looked stern. To date, 500 people had been to space, many of whom were declared mentally unstable upon return. Yet, they were all top talents who had undergone rigorous training. How could they easily break down mentally? Clearly, someone was covering something up. There was definitely something wrong in outer space. The impact was too much for Joe. She needed to go back and digest everything. Before parting, the elderly lady gave her several ghost tapes. Joe intended to refuse but was forcibly handed them. At this time, Henry was unaware his experimental material had been stolen. He suddenly received a call from Irina, who said she had just watched a report where a Nobel Prize-winning physicist in physics stated that the key point of quantum mechanics is the entanglement of 2 or more particles, where a change in one particle affects the state of another. After pondering this, Henry, having composed himself, returned to work in the lab and discovered his experimental material was missing. He immediately called Irina, hoping she could help him. Henry wanted to go to the restroom to wash his face and calm down, but he heard his own voice on the phone. In another parallel world, a Henry in a floral shirt was speaking on the phone. Could it be that the 2 worlds were overlapping again? The Henry in white seemed unfazed, writing a message with steam on the mirror. The other Henry actually saw the words, "Leave me alone," and, despite his gloomy expression, hung up the phone. Henry then found his colleague. He planned to search for Joe together, as she likely took the new experimental material. However, since the quantum entanglement experiment had been defunded by investors, no one cared about the theft. Henry suddenly rolled his eyes, noticing a large wet patch on his pants, then firmly stated that he must find the experimental equipment. After his colleague finally agreed, Henry quickly entered the restroom, his face full of anger, greeting his reflection in the mirror. When he turned around again, the Henry in the floral shirt appeared in the mirror. The Henry in white asked if the other had stopped taking his medication, to which the other nodded, expressing a desire for revenge because the Henry in white had sent the quantum entanglement equipment to the space station, causing a mess. The floral shirt Henry angrily declared that he would come to his world to settle the score. The white-clothed Henry said it was impossible, but the other suddenly retorted, "I made you wet your pants." Meanwhile, Joe was preparing to take her daughter to a cabin in the woods, her mind full of questions. She let Alice play those ghost tapes again, which sounded much clearer than what they had heard on the boat. Curiously, Joe brought the recorder close to the experimental equipment, and there was no static at all. Joe finally realized the peculiarities of the experimental equipment. When they reached a fork in the road, she suddenly stopped the car. Frowning, Joe remembered there was no fork here, but Alice casually pointed to the left, passing over the frozen lake surface until they finally reached the vacation cabin. After her daughter fell asleep, Joe took out a box of ghost tapes, the contents of which were very clear, specifically the communication recordings before the collision accident. Suddenly, an explosion sounded, and Joe immediately turned off the player. Alice also heard the recording but didn't expect her response. The little girl in the recording wasn't herself, as she didn't speak Swedish and never called Joe Mom. This concludes the content of episodes 4 and 5. The plot has become clearer by this point. In the first episode, Joe hurriedly took her daughter to the cabin, then met another Alice. This was likely caused by the experimental equipment creating a spatial overlap. Since the Joe from another world had died in the space station, Alice on this side was very surprised to see her mother. The ending of this episode confirms this, as there apparently exists another version of herself in the world. However, what shocked Joe more was not this revelation, but the content at the end of the tape, clearly, in the explosion and collision, Joe should have died, and the commander who should have been dead was fine, likely an event from another parallel world. Joe was gradually realizing the truth, while the experiment leader, Henry, knew more details. He could even communicate with another version of himself from a parallel world. As long as one side stopped taking medication, their intersection became more intense, which might be why the space agency wanted Joe to take the medication. What surprises the future holds is unknown, but those interested should continue to follow the story. See you in the next episode.